I would like to start by thanking all of you for making the time and joining us today. So my name is Laureline Simon. I'm the founder and executive director of One Resilient Earth, a nonprofit foundation based in Bonn, Germany, with a mission to raise awareness about all the impacts of climate change, including on our emotional and mental health, and to build the resilience of individuals, communities, and ecosystems to the ecological crisis through an approach that is transdisciplinary and regenerative, and that fosters synergies between art, science, ancient wisdom, and new technologies. It's a pleasure to introduce this workshop, which opens a space to learn and reflect together on alternative ways of learning, that is learning from storytelling, from the arts, and from Indigenous people's knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, with the view to restoring people, nature, and culture following crisis. And this collective reflection process will be essentially informed by a presentation of Kalikasan, so the Living Story Landscape Project, a passion project led by Sarah Keblatin, who is the co-founder of the Green Releaf Initiative in Cebu in the Philippines, which you'll hear more about in her presentation. So just to give you a short introduction about Sarah. So Sarah is an inclusive design strategist, passionate in transforming the narrative of disaster risk reduction into design for resilience and regeneration. With a background in mental health and psychosocial support, eco-psychology, and expressive arts, she applied a trauma-informed understanding of regenerative resilience in her work with climate and conflict vulnerable communities. She started Green Releaf in the Philippines, working with regenerative solutions in climate and conflict vulnerable communities. She combines this work with Kalikasan, so the Living Story Landscapes, working with local culture bearers and creatives in designing places of remembrance, resilience, and regeneration in communities facing loss and damage from climate emergencies. So Sarah is also shaping a dialogue journey on decolonizing and transforming narratives of ecosystem restoration between the global north and south, called Restore, Restory, where learnings can offer shared wisdom, collective healing, and emerging ways of regeneration from countries already facing harsh climate emergencies around the world. So I had the opportunity to meet Sarah through the Conscious Food Systems Alliance, which is an alliance led by the UN Development Program, and there was an immediate resonance and lots of parallels in our respective work that address climate change impacts, including mental health impacts, loss and damage, resilience, and regeneration through arts and culture. And the Living Story Landscape Project is intended to document the natural and cultural heritage of communities vulnerable to conflict and climate change as a way to contribute to the restoration of people, nature, and culture. And I was fascinated by this approach and the lessons learned from the project. The Living Story Landscape Project also resonated with the learning offer on resilience and regeneration that we are currently developing at One Resilient Earth to support other groups of people vulnerable to climate change impacts in different ways. And in our case, our target groups are essentially the youth around the world, but also citizens of Europe and North America, or the West more generally, who are already affected by climate change or extremely worried about the impacts of climate change. So the learning journey on climate resilience and regeneration that we are working on at One Resilient Earth builds heavily on storytelling and mobilizing the arts and ancient wisdom tradition, including mindfulness inspired by Zen Buddhism, and the knowledge of Indigenous peoples and other traditional nature custodians. One Resilient Earth also runs weekly youth climate circles, in addition to climate worker circles, where participants are invited to share their own emotions, feelings, insights, and breakthroughs in relation to climate change through stories in a safe space where open sharing and deep listening is practiced together. Last, we mobilize transdisciplinary and regenerative approach to support local communities who reach out to us for advice, including by facilitating or catalyzing support to build a long-term resilience to climate change impact. However, our work is continuously in progress, and that's why we're interested to share about our work and questions, but also to hear your thoughts and the approaches that you mobilize as part of a conversation. We're also very interested in the convergences and divergences in terms of resilience and regeneration between global north and global south, or west and east, maybe in our case. And so the workshop will be structured in the following way, around this question: how can we learn from the arts and culture in restoring ourselves, our communities, and nature? So first, there will be a presentation by Sarah of the Living Story Landscape Project, followed by a short Q&A session. Then Sarah and I will address a few of the most burning questions that come out of our work and that we feel are particularly relevant to activities that are being implemented on the ground. We'll then have small breakout group discussions for you to dive deeper into those questions for about 20 minutes. And then we'll spend some time harvesting collective wisdom as a group, and also ask more questions before concluding with some takeaways. So that's for the overall plan. And I will now give the floor to Sarah to present her project.
Thank you so much, Laureline, and thank you everyone for being here. Can you hear me well? Yes, I am in a quarantine hotel room. I just and I'm kind of stuck with some quarantine hotel stuff, but I'm really grateful and privileged to still have a place to stay. And I'm in Cebu City from the Philippines. We're just recovering from a massive super typhoon. So I'm actually relieved there's already power and water now. So and I'm really grateful to Laureline for inviting and for also sharing her dream in this process, and to listen to the journey as well that One Resilient Earth has been going through, and also the resonance that we're sharing together in this work. And in the process of learning from each other, it's also meaningful that we share this space with people who are also probably doing this work, as some of you I know are here, and probably people we don't know yet, maybe probably doing this as well. So I will be sharing about a passion project, which could be just an example, among the many probably of this practice of working with the arts and culture. So a little bit to add to that, this started actually because I was trying to combine my path as a eco-village designer, permaculture designer, working in conflict and climate vulnerable areas. But also, I'm also an artist at heart. I'm a frustrated artist, I guess. And I probably am one of a few people, probably you, or probably people that who didn't pursue their arts practice because you need to work and earn a living and all these things. So try to marry the creative path this way. And I came across stories of loss and damages after every climate impact and conflict displacement. And one way it's to bring back is the process of placemaking. So in our work in working with gardens, permaculture gardens in evacuation centers and resettlement, is to bring back like their traditional food and their medicine and the stories around it and recipes. And that's also one way to bring them back to their sense of being and their belonging, even if they're no longer living in the place. And in places where they're still living in their place, how can they remember, the cultural and natural heritage that they keep true to the value of this place, and that they don't get lost in the valuation of, financing them for livelihoods, and so that they could also recover from that typhoon impacts. So I'll share my screen really quick. Hopefully it's not going to be that long, but just to present Kalikasan, I'll share a little bit later what Kalikasan means. When you say living story landscapes, it's just because they're living stories. It's stories lived and passed on across these Indigenous, and most of the people we work with after climate change impacts are often the minorities, and we've been for some reason invited to keep working with Indigenous communities. Although now with the recent typhoons locally, it's the lowlanders, but they also still have their traditional ecological knowledge in place that we also want to continue honoring. So one message that I'm sharing here is a message from one of the tribal chieftains that I've worked with for the peace process in the Philippines. He says, when you think of it, Indigenous peoples possess the biggest book because our book is the whole world. You read the forest, the wind, the clouds, it is the biggest book. And for many years working with Indigenous communities, we always value that the narratives are passed on orally, and so a culture where the written approaches are not so dominant. A lot of them are told through stories, and there's a lot of mythic imagination in the process, and also that a lot of it is also embodied and not just spoken. And so I hold so much appreciation to that as well. And so when we gather them in planning and bringing together their resilience plans and approaches, we also try to combine storytelling in the process, because it's the best way for them to bring out their stories of resilience, their dreams, and their visions. This is a visioning for a DRR workshop, disaster risk reduction workshop for the Kankanay people in Sagada, in the north of the Philippines. So Kalikasan means, in the Philippines, the word for environment is Kalikasan, but I added H there because the core word of likha is creation. And in the Philippines, we use the word ka to connote the sense of shared self from many of our root words. And so just giving, this is an image of a ritual from our pre-colonial traditions led by the Babaylan, our shamans in the Philippines. And they have deep connection with nature and nature spirits. And that's also part of the tradition that I have been learning from. So our intention is to restore and restore. So when communities have lost their homes and their places or their habitats, our sense of identity and belonging is lost. And this is also why when we work with resilience, in my background, my first humanitarian intervention, my introduction to humanitarian work was actually with psychosocial support. And so the protocol is to help people remember the resilience. And in the process of that resilience work is bringing a restoration process, restoring what was lost, restoring their sense of being. But working with the place is restoring their identities in relation to the place, their the memories they hold of where they grew up, or what was important to them as recipes they've learned, they've passed on, and some traditional medicine they've used. And then to story, because many climate and conflict vulnerable communities have had to go through loss and displacement, and how can we create a new narrative from that loss? Of course, from a trauma-informed lens, is to work with the grief process and to help the remembering and be able to design a new system through the tools we use with fracturing the village and the traditional ecological knowledge. And that way we change the narrative of what happened to them. So we do this because most of the communities we work with are often driven to unsustainable practices after climate change. So one village we work with in the north of the Philippines, we were invited by the Department of Education as that they turned to GM corn after losing. There was a failed program prior, like years ago, that was invested heavily on the coffee of this town, because they used to be the first coffee processing village of the brand called Kalinga Coffee. And that because it's the land and the heritage coffee they had. But because of that failure, they started growing GMO corn, which led to a lot of the vulnerability they have because of the cultures and the loss of their trees and forests, and the damages that are happening with their soil that can't hold because of the degraded soil from the chemicals. So this is part of the context why we are supporting them in their remembering of their traditional knowledge, and then how it can offer opportunity for the needs that they have for livelihood and ecosystem resilience. So this is an agroforestry project with the Department of Trade and Industry, where coffee can be grown with native trees in the place. And so also where who do we work with? So definitely those who survived, and ideally we would put the culture bearers of the place and wisdom keepers as well, because they hold a lot of the wisdom. And so in one village, this is Typhoon Haiyan in Leyte, but just to show you a garden we designed with the seeds, where a daycare center stood and flew away from a typhoon. And one way is to remember, the local food and the local stories, the storytelling of survival and gratitude. That we've also worked with in south of the Philippines with Cebu, with the Tiboli people, restoring their food systems, indigenous food systems, and starting with the traditional ecological knowledge they have, their rituals and their offerings to the nature spirits. And that way we integrated in a integrated food forest system for because that's communal, because they have a communal farming system and food system. So we're also engaging these, then bringing the younger people, the younger generation in the process, because they are more working with technology. And so in integrating technology from tech, that's TECH, to tech, which is traditional ecological knowledge. So that intergenerational collaboration enables the documentation and the passing on of knowledge. And so what is it? It's a collaborative placemaking initiative. So we really want people to be connected to their place, and then bringing in, because there's a lot of data based on a place, like especially climate vulnerability data, but we want to bring them into, like, yes, there can be citizen science, there can be ways to generate, how do you measure the soil nutrients, or how to measure the wind speed or water, but also how do you kind of bring in the stories of, resilience of this land, and how of the trees that they have, and what are still ways that they still bring in reverence to these trees. There's some villages we work with that they still do rituals before they cut the trees, to let the spirits in the tree know that they have to move to another tree. So a lot of this sense of value still are in place, but then because of modernization and climate change, a lot of them also get lost, and we want to keep that integrated in the process. And how? So yeah, like using design tools, we try to integrate designing with planning, with data gathering and visioning. And so from this, like, we've developed some tools that is story based, it's visual based, but then it can be part of a log frame and an action plan for the community. So like it's basic aspects of a tree can become a log frame, and can be part of a basis of a proposal. So this is a ERR project with that Indigenous community in Sagada. So this is also one way to balance, the storytelling and the data gathering and generation of action plans. Of course, it's also a resilience mapping platform, because we're dealing with the climate vulnerability. So through photography and 3D mapping, working with the landscape, creating it as a 2D or 3D dimensional model. So when people know where their sacred sites are, where their areas of economic importance or social importance, then those areas can be also combined in the storytelling, and then they can also bring in like what are important stories or values that valuations that are held in that place that we can keep restoring and restoring. So this is the photographs of places in the place that they did, so that they are also valuing in their place apart from their residences and locations, so that they can also continue mapping. And then we also dream of it as the place is a living library and museum. Of course, the most ideal is we set up actually a real demonstration site, because we develop demonstration site using permaculture and agroecology practices. And that is actually the place where we want to store the seeds, as saving the seeds, and then the photographs and the recordings, and that becomes a place where they also share their action plans and learning tools. So that structure was never possible because our funding was always limited, but we did have the activities, and we used the demo site as one of the places to share these photographs and stories. This is just a model, like this indigenous village we work with still have upland rice, and then also that they have the rice granaries where they share rice during harvest and store it after. And so many ways. Also mapping is part of it, because there are many dimensions to a place, the cultural, social, economic, and ecological dimensions. And we're also trying to that mapping model we shared earlier, so that then when people value their place and the components of their place, they can develop action plans to restore and restore these aspects of their life after loss and damages and displacement. So using the arts, of course, from many levels, in many ways we can do it, depends on what's needed in the place. So for example, this is a materials recovery segregator for metal, paper, plastic in an evacuation center. And we work with muralists to bring in the okir, the symbol of the Maranao people. So there's also a sense of place and belonging for the people displaced, the Maranao people that were displaced from one Islamic city by ISIS. So it's also one way to bring a sense of home. So that's also one way we use the arts. And of course, we're dreaming of integrating digital tools with it. So we're also working with as a telecom company to help use smartphones as one way for them to document like the traditional medicinal plants and tell the story of this plant, so that they can also kind of keep on remembering, and the younger people can keep learning from their elders through these technologies. And so just we work in the areas where these memories are already dying, or that are vulnerable to getting lost, and that they can be models of this resilience and regeneration and living stories that are held in the landscape. So so that's a little bit about our living story landscapes, and I think I'm over the time, so I'm gonna stop sharing now and pass it on to Lauren.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Well, you're actually right on time. And so before we move into the breakout group work, I would just like to ask a few questions to Sarah that I'll try to answer also from the perspective of One Resilient Earth, and that could help inform the discussions that we have afterwards. So I think the main question is like, how is the approach you develop for the Kalikasan project innovative compared to more mainstream capacity building approaches to sustainability and even climate change adaptation or disaster risk reduction and resilience, or what we call nature-based solution? What do you think is the value added? What is new about it in this field?
Thanks, Laureline, and looking forward to sharing the same question here and hearing more about your journey as well. And for this question, the innovation, I believe I'm not entirely sure if this is really entirely unique, but what I have seen at least is that because we use storytelling and visual representations, it kind of because I've studied expressive arts therapy and other creative methodologies, it also brings us to it's not, I would say not, I'm not saying it's not logical, but it is relatable. It's from their own tacit knowing. It honors their tacit knowing, something that they've lived every day and see every day. It's common sense. This is also what Indigenous people speak about. It's just common sense to us to think this way, and so it allows a sense of ownership, and that they also own the story and they own the vision. It's also because what I also observed on the field is like a lot of, because development plans are often linear, like when you plan, like, you know, the stages of change that needs to take place, at least before design thinking became like a norm. It has often been this, you know, log frame, or you start with a plan and objective and then you implement in a linear way. So when we also tested the three parts that became like the log frame, we also told the story a different way, from the roots to the fruits, which came from the sense of purpose or a deeper wisdom that is inspiring their vision. And that actually becomes a starting point instead of, you know, what do we want for the community? And so what do we want as an outcome? But the origin place from the roots representation is really what is the deeper purpose why we're doing this, and what is the higher call why we're doing this. So it invites us to also come back to the worldview of a deeper connection to the earth. And so I guess for me, it's very humbling to see it, that because it is the worldview that often Indigenous peoples look at from, and it allows a more, it's relatable to them, it's simple, and at least that's what we heard. But of course, there are also times that we also failed in the process. Like for example, we wanted an equitable sharing of relief goods to them. Some families we suggested would have more relief goods because they have more children, and some families would have less because they have less children. But eventually, you know, our world, if you give to everybody, you have to give to everybody so that people feel that they are everyone, it's fair, everyone is not left out, and then we will be sharing to those extra for others. And so that actually is a worldview that that shifts our thinking on development, at least for me, that bringing it back to them, like what is how do they see a change for themselves. And for me, that's the innovation, I guess. I think that's maybe an innovation that you has to be the mainstream, but because our mainstream is disconnected, then their worldview is the innovation. So so let me pass that on. Let me pass that on to you, Laureline, about your story and your work as well with the learning journey you're developing with Europeans.
Yeah, I'm happy to try and answer. What's interesting for me, or what drove me into working with partners and developing this learning journey, is that I've been working on knowledge management in relation to climate adaptation for a number of years. I mean, before starting One Resilient Earth, I used to be working with the French Development Agency, and then I worked with the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, specifically on knowledge management in relation to adaptation. And I remember supporting a number of projects and initiatives that were all about how can we basically give access to resources for people to learn about adaptation and to carry out adaptation locally, and what are the capacity building resources that are available out there. And so there were huge websites, you know, full of case studies and manuals and guides. And and lots of experience that was coming up from different regions, but also lots of work being done by academics and scientists and experts, looking at what climate adaptation means, what disaster risk reduction means. And I remember working on some projects where I was in charge of helping develop a compendium, I think, on capacity building resources, or it must have been something like that, like what were basically all the guides and the manuals and the trainings available. And you had dozens of them. And they were, some were older than others. But overall, you had the impression that, everybody's trying to come up with a way to somehow help people with this adaptation agenda. But is it really reaching out the beneficiaries? Is it really helping people off the ground? Is it the type of ways of learning and of knowledge that's needed to actually support communities that are in crisis, that have little resources at a given point, that may not have access to climate data, especially downscale climate data? And so what can be done in situations that are, I would say, not ideal by the standpoints of the global north, in the sense where we have different context and different access to science and resources and infrastructure and all of this? And what can be done by people who may not be experts too? And so with this idea of developing a climate resilience and regeneration learning journey, we really wanted to provide information that's easily understandable about what climate change impacts are, reflect also on how those impacts are already affecting us in terms of emotional and mental health, and introduce this approach in terms of regeneration, which is extremely generative in many ways, of different solutions that helps people reconnect with nature in the process of developing generative agriculture projects, even if it's small community projects or personal projects. And also that brings in the arts through different, through performance arts or visual arts or different types of arts that can help also reflect on how we relate to nature and how we relate to one another in this context of crisis. And through this project, we were definitely informed by Indigenous people's knowledge, because I guess you can't really talk about regeneration or regenerative practices without connecting to a worldview that's very much shared by a number of Indigenous peoples around the world. And what interested us a lot is more like the process of knowing from nature and the process of learning in contact with nature that we can also learn from. And we really wanted to acknowledge this this learning we benefited from, and to also highlight the wealth of understanding, knowledge, different alternative processes to dealing with climate change that there are among Indigenous peoples. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you for sharing. And yeah, later on you will be sharing your website and amazing data and stories and exhibitions and interviews you've also held there, right? So that in case people want to see and read more about what you've shared. Thanks, Lauren.